Good afternoon. Well, good morning for those on the East Coast. And my name is Dr. Monica White-Ndounou. I am an associate professor of theater, film and media studies, and African American studies at Dartmouth College. I'm also the founder and executive director of the Craft Institute, a nonprofit organization dedicated to curating culturally inclusive ecosystems throughout the world of arts and entertainment. Welcome to today's Plenary for ATHE, and we are focusing on the topic of anti-racist pedagogies. I want to give you a quick overview of what to expect in terms of the conversations that we'll be having today. I would like for us to begin just kind of situating ourselves. Number one, you are welcome to, in the chat, identify the lands of the indigenous peoples that you are joining us from today, along with naming an ancestor that has inspired your work. Additionally, I would like for us to just ground ourselves by taking a moment to take a breath together. And one of the reasons for this is because for several years, I have participated in ATHE plenaries, either as part of the conference planning committee, as a speaker or organizer in some form. And as my colleague and collaborator, Dr. Nicole Hodges personally noted on yesterday's plenary, that we've been having these conversations for several years in multiple spaces, and we're definitely eager to move towards collective action. So today's conversation is really geared towards thinking about what actions can we take within the realm of our academic institutions, department, and programs, and also on an individual level. So without further ado, I'm going to invite some of our speakers for today, well, all of our speakers for today, to join me, and they will introduce themselves and give a brief overview of the work that they do. Before they join, I do want to remind that this is not a debate about whether white supremacy, institutionalized racism, or anti-Blackness is an issue. This is a conversation about what work are we going to do to fix it. So thank you everyone for joining. As attendees that are viewing this panel, panelists, thank you for joining. Please turn on your cameras and introduce yourselves. So Eve, would you like to start?
Yes. Good morning or afternoon to everyone. My name is Eve Graves, and I'm the chairperson of the Theater and Communication Studies Department at Clark Atlanta University. CAU, Clark Atlanta University, is a historically Black college university situated in the heart of Atlanta and part of the four-school consortium, which used to include Morris Brown University, which is on a comeback, as well as Spelman College, of which I'm a proud alum, Morehouse College, a theological center, and as I mentioned before, Clark Atlanta University. I would like to acknowledge my mentors, ancestors, starting with both of my grandmothers, one who was from the Midwest of the country after, of course, travails with slavery and her grandfather moving to that area, but she was an incredible woman, incredible family, incredible woman who earned a master's degree at a time during the Great Depression when that was very, very challenging. And she was always the head of her class, but unable to accept that role because she was a woman of color. She persevered. She went on to be an educator. She could not work as an educator after receiving her degree because she relocated to Buffalo, New York, and they didn't hire Black teachers. So she went upstate and worked at a school, an all-Black school, and then moved back to Buffalo, worked as a washerwoman with a master's degree until she was able to work in the public school system, which she eventually retired from, and was very actively involved in lots of organizations in the Buffalo area, especially for African Americans. So shout out to the Lynx and to Delta Sigma Theta sorority and many others that nurtured me as a child and helped my grandmother find community and identity in a world that did not welcome her. And my other grandmother I'd like to pay homage to, who worked as a domestic in Buffalo, New York as well for many, many years, taught herself to read using the newspaper. So all of that just invigorates and fuels me in the work that I do at Clark Atlanta University. And my work deals with my early work with the Harlem Renaissance, and that's still an area of passion for me. I am the Director of Education and Formal Training for the Craft Institute, and so proud to work with Monica and others in that capacity. And the key thing that drives me is how to make the invisible visible at Clark Atlanta University and for all students, all HBCU students. When I worked for a very well-known institution, I was highly recognized at ATHE. And people read your name badge, and I was somebody. But when I made the choice to work at an HBCU, I became invisible, as many HBCU students are. So I'm an advocate for them and for our history, a school founded by freed slaves, and that is important history that I want to memorialize through my work as an educator. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. Who'd like to go next?
I can go. My name is Coya Brownrigg, and I occupy a couple of different institutional positions. I'm currently serving as the interim dean at the theater school at DePaul University in Chicago. Normally, I am part of the theater studies department in the theater school, teaching, directing, ensemble practice, and history. I'm also the artistic director of the historic Free Street Theater in Chicago, which has been using theater to challenge Chicago's racial and economic segregation since 1969. We just turned 52. And so one of the things I think about a lot, my work is focused heavily on arts equity in Chicago. That's what I'm interested in. And I think it's important to say that that's largely a geographic project, not a representational one, because Chicago is the most segregated city in the country. And our arts economy is similarly segregated. 78% of people who make any money at all in Chicago theater are white. Almost all of the formal institutions designed to house or make theater are located in the wealthiest and whitest corridor of the city. And I don't think I need to say this, but I will just in case. Chicago is not majority white nor majority wealthy. One of the ironies of this is that Chicago is and was the ancestral homeland of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi people, and we have one of the largest populations of urban indigenous people in the country. And part of what made Chicago Chicago is that it was this place where the Mississippi River met the Great Lakes. So lots of indigenous people coming to trade. Like all of our diagonal cities in Chicago were like trade pathways. And yet somehow we have become like this place that has disappeared our indigenous people from the narrative. We are the most segregated city in the country, right? Like we have so much to undo. And then sitting in this little jewel of a conservatory in this wealthy white part of the city, serving mostly wealthy white students who love theater, right? What does it mean then to sort of take that work and put it in context, not just of our city, but our country and our globe? So that was a lot. I'm not even sure I answered the question. I would always like to say that the people who shaped my life the most were my grandmother, ATHE, my uncle, Eli, who was like my grandfather, both immigrants. Both really believed that the arts made life worth living, and that they were not separate from anything else we do in our life. So that's really important. And then my academic mentor is E. Patrick Johnson, the great and wonderful. And he taught me that you can be smart and funny and bring your whole self to the classroom, and you better. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Coya. Yutian, would you like to go?
Hi, my name is Yutian Wong, and I'm a professor in the School of Theater and Dance at San Francisco State University. I'm a dance scholar, so I teach primarily in the dance side of things in our school. So I'd just like to recognize my ancestors, my grandmother, Zhang Yingqing, who managed to receive a college degree sometime in the 1930s in the midst of a war. And so this past year in the pandemic, I've really been thinking about her and sort of how hard and how much she had sort of persevered, right, to manage to continue her education during a time of really great political, civil upheaval. My academic mentors are Susan Foster and Marta Savigliano. So I've been teaching at San Francisco State since 2009. So prior to coming to San Francisco State, I've taught at a number of different institutions, very different institutions from San Francisco State. So San Francisco State, we're a large public state university. We are a considered a Hispanic serving institution, and we also have a very large Asian American population since we are here in San Francisco. So my research has been focused on Asian American performance. So I've written about performance art, as well as Asian Americans and Orientalist critique in modern dance. And most recently, I've been writing about Asian Americans dance and popular culture.
Thank you, John.
Hi, I'm John Rossini. I'm zooming in from the ancestral homelands of the Nisenan peoples in Northern California. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Theater and Dance at the University of California at Davis, which is a large research institution with a large percentage of first generation students. We're almost certified as an HSI, and we have a wide range of diversity in our spaces. I would say I appreciated Yutian and others distinguishing between personal and academic mentors in that way. And I say that one of my personal mentors is my mother, Maria Miranda. I will not put my father's last name on that for the moment, just to leave her name that way, who was a first generation immigrant from the Philippines and who actually came to the US to go to graduate school at Berkeley, and this odd different kind of history, right? She finished her architecture degree in the Philippines in like 3 years or something insane. And my academic mentors, John Klum and Jorge Huerta. So two things about my current work. One, I just put a small essay in a very interesting collection of things in the Journal of Dramatic Theory and Criticism that Michelle Lucarriger was editing about the idea of the performative. And I just wanted to gesture to the idea of the amount of labor that goes in before we get to see these spectacular moments of change, that we sometimes forget that it takes time and labor to get to a point when there's some transformation. The other things I'm working on as a scholar right now is in relationship to diasporic Puerto Rican drama. And it, in part, my project shifted in structure because of thinking about systemic issues. And when you're dealing with systemic issues, you can't really get any more systemic than the colonial situation of Puerto Rico right now, right? If you're on the island of Puerto Rico, then you don't vote. You're a US citizen who does not vote in federal elections. You must go to the continental US to vote in federal elections. So that's me.
Thank you so much. So as I mentioned earlier, I kind of want to reframe the conversation a bit. Instead of just thinking about, moving towards anti-racist pedagogies, I want to be transparent about my position on anti-racism and anti-racist pedagogy, where there's folks who do the work that I really admire, people like Nicole Brewer, who I think her approach to the work is fantastic and highly recommended. But not everyone is taking the same approach that she is, where she recognizes that anti-racism is not the end all be all of everything, that it is a step in the direction of where we need to go, but there's additional work that needs to continue. And so in reframing the conversation, I want to encourage folks to think about anti-racist pedagogies through the lens of repair, reparation, which aligns with the theme of the conference. So in thinking about, naming the harms that have been done historically, institutionally, and to individuals working within those institutions, how can we begin to move forward or move towards anti-racist pedagogies that actually achieve the goal of repairing that harm? And so that's, the lens that I'm, kind of looking at this panel through. And I want to encourage those who are listening today. First of all, I want to acknowledge that this conversation may be somewhat triggering for people of the global majority, particularly that have been doing this work and have gone unacknowledged, and in some cases have been punished for doing this work that is now receiving all of this attention. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge you and thank you. And to also encourage you that if you do find it triggering, to take a moment to breathe and/or step away if you need to, and return when you feel ready to engage. And to say, for those who are new to the work and really open to seeing how to get involved, please listen closely as the panelists tell you about the areas in which they're interested and some of the work they're engaged in and opportunities that you can get involved with that work. So I'll be sharing some, things in the chat here and there, just to folks, you're welcome to share your, if you want to amen, in agreement with things that are being said, feel free to do so in the chat. I'm going to share a Padlet where I encourage you, if you'd like to name harm that's been done within the institutions of academia, you'll be able to do so anonymously in that space if you don't feel comfortable doing so in the chat. And I'll also share a Padlet that will allow you to name potential solutions or things that you would like to do or see moving forward. So watch the chat for those. This is going to be a hopefully fluid conversation where we will actually pick up on some of the ideas, the thoughts that were shared yesterday. So I'd like to begin by doing that by asking each of the panelists to identify any of the through lines. We received a list of some of the things that resonated yesterday that might show up in our conversation today. Are there any through lines from yesterday that you would like to start this conversation? Okay, John.
I want to start with one of the lines about the glacial pace of academic change, the amount of resistance. Several of the people on the panel spoke about really strong resistances at the department level, and then as Coya has moved up into higher levels of administration, the lack of awareness and the resistance at the upper administration level. And I don't want to be in any way naive in this comment, but I also want to say, for those of us who are privileged to be tenured, we actually have the capacity to endure in some ways and not stop trying, because we can stay with the institution. And so I want to put that out, because on the simplest level of curricular reform, people will put in a class and then it will be turned back for some reason, and then they will stop. And you actually can put it back in. And sometimes some of the slowness of it becomes because we were disappointed that it didn't go through, it didn't happen, instead of just simply pushing again and then getting clarification and pushing again and then getting clarification. I'm not saying it's simple. I'm not saying you're not fighting against stuff, but it reminded me that, especially for those of us who are in a privileged tenured position, that we are there for a long time. And so 5 years is not that long a time. I'm not saying there isn't urgent, necessary things that have to happen now. And I think that's another conversation. And some of the urgent, necessary things in our own classrooms, we have some control and agency over. Some urgent, necessary things in the space we have some control over, and some we don't. But I just wanted to put that out there for us to think about as well.
Thank you. Did anybody want to add to that? You too.
Can I add to that? As I was, as that question did come up multiple times in our, conversation before this panel. One of the things that I've been really thinking about that, right? Because there are so many different kinds of reasons, right, that sort of progress and change stalls, right? So yes, for those of us who are tenured, right, we assume that we have, a lot of power, right, to continue to endure, and that is true. So one of the things that I've been negotiating, right, is so power differentials, right, between tenure track faculty and also lecturers. So in my unit, lecturers are very, very important. So, important to our ability, right, to teach our curriculum, right, to help students graduate. And so some of those conversations, right, about change can be, very threatening to folks, especially if, their jobs are, contingent, right, about particular kinds of classes, right, particular kinds of specialties sort of being, centered or, where they are positioned, right, in the curriculum, whether it's a required course or it's an elective, right, especially in moments where resources are scarce, right, and everyone's clamoring, for the same pool of students, perceived same pool of students, right. So that's one thing that I've, really have been thinking a lot about is sort of how to have those conversations with people in a way, because ultimately, right, we are dealing, with people's and sort of their feelings about sort of kind of what is happening within a department. And one of the things I've, and I think I mentioned this before, right, is because of, what happened during the pandemic, we were completely online, right, for an entire year. We didn't have any hybrid classes at all or face-to-face. I know some dance departments did, right, where that complete sort of shutdown, right, really kind of called into questions all of the assumptions that everyone had, about, what is this, what is this discipline, right? Questions about, what is professionalism? What are we actually, what are we offering students? What are we preparing them to do, right? We don't know at this moment. We don't know exactly what we're preparing them to do. So at this, this sort of strange, this, global pandemic happened, uprooted so many lives in so many different ways. But then at the same time, we're kind of at this moment of being actually able to kind of rebuild and rethink, right? Because so many of our assumptions have really disappeared.
If I may just interject, I'd like to add on to what my fellow panelists have said, as well as sort of move us a little bit in a different direction. I want to talk about the burden of a racialized identity. First of all, I think the default is we're talking about working at a PWI, right? But I do not, and I've worked at even non-traditional PWIs. So we can discuss tenure and the power of tenure, but it operates completely differently in these spaces. So I don't want us to negate that and feel like there's this sort of monolithic understanding of what tenure is at certain institutions, because it does vary, and interpersonal relationships and hierarchical systems at these different institutions varies as well. If you're at a 2-year institution, 4-year institution, culturally specific institution, all of these different things. So I just wanted to add that to what John was saying, and Yutian as well, because I think that those discussions are very important. The other thing that I want to talk about for me is, as a professor at a HBCU, is I am aware of the legacy of my ancestors, bringing that into this space, how that informs how I teach. That's an important part of my pedagogy, as well as responsibility. I am training students who have chosen to attend these institutions like many of their ancestors from the 1800s to the present. And how does that read? You know, they know that there are perceptions about HBCUs being less than. Even now, I mean, they're left out of the conversation. There are very few conversations that happen at ATHE that deal with HBCUs, our identity, our performative history, and all of these things. So all of that is in the space that I work with them. And so because of that, I have to make sure that they have a seat at the table. And how do they do that? I mean, I can sit back and theoretically, we can discuss this and, you know, and dream, and I believe in dreaming. So dreaming all of these wonderful things, but the immediacy of my responsibility, which is that burden of a racialized identity, is to make sure they have a seat at the table. And I know that they're coming in less than. And so this kind of connects to the discussion yesterday. Shout out to Nicole Hodges-Persley, my Spelman sister, who's a brilliant director and scholar. And so I think she really, you know, navigated this well as people were discussing this idea of graduate education. And is it necessary? It is necessary for my students. And let me tell you why. Because of the erasure of what's happening at HBCUs. So they show up in audition, they show up at other spaces. It's like, where did you go to school? Oh, I'm not familiar. You didn't go to Spelman or Morehouse. Those are the only two, and Howard, or, you know, the only three we recognize. You didn't go to, you know, one of those schools. Who are you? What do you bring to the table? I don't recognize you. So I need them to go to these other schools, and so that they then will get a seat at the table, and then they can bring back the identity of the HBCU. They can name it, they can position it with authority. So we have to play all of these different games and all of these spaces so that they do have a seat at the table, if you will. And so that's just a little tidbit of some of the burden that I'm dealing with. And we all have burdens, and I hope that we're able to discuss this and figure out how to navigate those.
Yeah, and I just want to add too, Eve, you bring up a very important point. And also as a beneficiary, I'm also an HBC alum, Spelman. Just be transparent, y'all. It's not a conspiracy. We just do our thing. But to just say, one of the things too that stood out for me when I was invited to moderate the panel is there was no HBCU representation on it. And so there is a constant erasure of culturally specific institutions in a lot of these conversations, which is my issue with highlighting anti-racist pedagogies that are now happening at predominantly white institutions. When you have institutions like historically Black colleges and universities that were founded on the principles of ensuring equity and inclusion for Black people in particular. And so thank you so much for nuancing that. Eve, are there any other through lines from yesterday that we want to touch on before we move into expanding on some of the questions?
Yeah, I wanted to sort of pick up on some of the things that are said and respond to a different issue. You know, it's one of the things that I have thought about a lot in the last year and a half, and I am at a PWI, is that for a lot of people, racism is theoretical. You know, for a lot of white people, it's a thing to study and understand and, you know, learn more about. And I remember when right after George Floyd was murdered, there's such unrest in Chicago, you know, and at Free Street, everybody was hitting the streets, going to protests, going to community cleanups, like that. We stopped all work to go do that. And meanwhile, I was asked to sit in committee after committee after committee meeting to talk about the problem and how should we respond. And we need to draft an anti-racism statement. And meanwhile, I'm hearing like helicopters going over my head, like 12, 15 hours a day because of where in the city I live. And I just remember being like, guys, like, what is happening here? To me, it was the most wild time to be an academic, with like this, like, we need some deep discussion about this. And I don't mean to make fun of my colleagues, but I was like, we're not a responsive sort of body, I think, is one of the problems with academia. And so we have to take our leadership from the field and from people on the street and people who are sort of doing the work in community, and to understand that, like, I think that we have to, one of the things that came up a lot yesterday was like, are we training students for the field? And one of the things I think about a lot in Chicago is like at the theater school, we have a lot of white students coming from other places, suburbs, other states, like that. I think that's the case in a lot of universities, not all, and I appreciate this sort of attention to, like, we need to understand, like, that history is not a monolith in terms of academia. But then they want to stay in the cities, like the people who come to Chicago to train want to stay in Chicago. And I'm like, this is the problem. Actually, like, a thing I say a lot to my students, and nobody likes it, is what you need to do is, like, come, get this education, right? So the beautiful new anti-racist education we think we're going to offer our students, and then take it back, please, to Iowa, Indiana, to your suburb, and create theatrical and arts communities there that are speaking to what is happening in parts of the country that are majority Black, brown, and immigrant. Not stay here and, because you care about anti-racism, get a job doing outreach to communities through regional theater. And like, that is like not the message I think a lot of people want to hear. I want to say, like, I will say, like, this go back message only for people who are from mostly white American communities. Like, you need to go do the work there, even if you don't like it and it's uncomfortable.
I want to jump on that preparation thing, and I'm the problematic academic sometimes that sits around and thinks about a lot of stuff and doesn't do enough stuff. And I'm trying to work through that, but I'm still, not there. And we should push on. But I also didn't grow up a theater person. I got a PhD in English. I was going to do this English stuff and read text and all this stuff. And so one of the things that's driven me crazy for the last 19 years that I've been in the theater department is production. And all the presumptions around, although the theater and the doing of the theater is at the center of our work, all the presumptions about how it has to be done and the way it has to be done, and this is what we do. And for a long time, I thought my colleagues knew what they were doing, and they do within the framework they've been taught, they assume is the right, or they're pointing toward a particular line of professionalism that is what they want to emulate. And I want to put a call out to think about both, what are we preparing people for? Because the artistic directors yesterday said that all artists have multiple identities now, and yet we're telling our students to specialize in one thing. We're creating a world where if you're a writer, you're a content producer, you're generating material for whatever space. But in doing that, how are we preparing, and how are we doing a process and modeling a process that's something different? Because the process that exists right now is wrong. Right. I mean, people don't have access. I have a student who was like, I can't be in a production because I'm a resident advisor, because I need to be a resident advisor to make, stuff. So, but I can't go to evening rehearsals. I can't go to this. I can't, that's not accounting for student parents. That's not accounting for, some of our models don't account for the complexity of the lives, specifically of the most, the most vulnerable students. Where can we start with the different process? Not just a different kind of product, because a lot of us are like, oh, let's do a new show. Let's do a Latino play. Let's find no, but where do you start? Where do you start the process to make it different? And I'm inviting the people who actually do the work in that way, Eve or Coya or Yutian and Monica, to say, I'm wondering what is like one thing you would do process-wise, maybe as something that you think is particularly powerful.
I'll go. I'll respond. Just because this is actually a specific issue that my department went through most recently. So one thing I discovered is people had very different definitions of kind of what equity means, what anti-racist work means. So there was a period after, when I first arrived at SF State where the prevailing model was about access in terms of providing students who would otherwise not have access to, that conservatory type training, right? That the idea was that for a fraction of the cost of tuition at, private institutions, right? Private schools, conservatories, even, fraction of the cost of UC campus, right? Students could get the kind of, training that they could get at, a more expensive institutions. And I think, that is sort of very real, right? Just the cost of an education. So, but, it's like, we make decisions, right? And, and I also find that, it takes a couple years to kind of see sort of what happens, right? Sort of what are the costs, did that actually create a situation that we had intended? What were the sort of foreseen results, right? And so one of the things that happened was we graduated several classes of, students, alum who have gone on to professional careers dancing with dance companies. They were very, very successful. But it came at a cost, right, of the students where that was not their goal, right? And created, sort of a real divide in the department. And, we're talking about a department where, like many dance departments, we're majority female. But I think unlike a lot of dance departments, the majority of our students are, women of color, right? So there were some unintended consequences, right? And so we've actually sort of gone back to a different model, right? Where we're no longer, we never auditioned students in the first place to get into our program. We are open enrollment. Anybody that wants to be a dance major can be a dance major. But we stopped auditioning students in terms of performance opportunities. So now what we do is we just, we divvy up any student that wants to perform, we cast them in something. Maybe casting isn't the right word, but we assign them to work with either a faculty or a guest choreographer, so that kind of gets rid of that perception, right? That, some students get to perform, others don't, because of perceived skill level. Because the truth is our students come with a whole range, right, of different skill levels, where some students come in with no training, having not had any, right? They've only seen dance on television, never taken a dance class, whereas other students come in with a lot. And I think that's, many other institutions have that too. So that ability, right? But that requires the ability to kind of, sort of pivot quickly, which sometimes sort of can be hard to do and, sort of contentious, right? sort of move out of those modes that people kind of, they develop their systems, right, of how they're teaching, what they're teaching. And so to convince people that, okay, we need to do this for these other reasons. Yeah.
Yes, Yutian, I want to build on, Eve, did you want to speak?
I did, but I can wait. No problem.
No,
Go
go
ahead,
ahead and
please.
say what you want to say. And then I think if you're responding to Yutian, then the question will still be relevant.
Awesome. Thank you. Just really briefly, I just wanted to say in response to John and building on or connecting with what Coya was saying and Yutian as well, for me, the non-traditional is traditional, right? So it's creating that visibility for the non-traditional or what is perceived to be non-traditional. So I have to work with students who, have to work all of the time and can't come to rehearsals in the evenings. That's normal for me. So it would be normal, abnormal if everybody could come at a particular time. And then working with a lack of resources, is normal for me. Our school motto is find a way or make one. So that I think is just part of our identity. So that's what I mean by, the non-traditional is traditional in not only the way that we represent ourselves in performance, in the theory that we study and create, but in all of those different things. And like Yutian was saying, there are just so many things that, we have to sort of create so that people students feel validated in what they're creating, and then people also come into that space. And that leads me to this idea of space that Coya was talking about, which is so relevant. I work in the West End. If you've ever been to Atlanta, how many of you have come to the West End to visit our campuses or anything that's happening? People stop at the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, move downtown, and they think, wow, that was enough. That's all I can take. I don't want to move over to the West End. And so many people that have grown up here are not familiar with a lot of our schools and also what's happening in the West End of Atlanta. So creating that visibility, one of the first things I did as chair when I bring in speakers, because I want them to come to that space, right, Coya? I want them to see what that is and to feel that sense of connecting and building in a particular space. But when I invite them in, I also contact local colleges and universities, UGA, Georgia State, Kennesaw, and I invite them to come because I've taken students there, but are you willing to come? Very few are. Very few are, if we just want to be honest, about that. So John, I think there's just so many, that's just such a great question and so many things that we have to think about. Thank you.
And I invite those who would like to answer that question on the Padlet, where it identifies solutions to the harm in academic programs, because that should be an ongoing question and an ongoing conversation and an ongoing strategic plan of action. There is a question in the Q&A, what I learned when I earned tenure: I can do the work and call the racist practices out, but that doesn't mean my colleagues will care, listen, or respond. How do we move from activating individuals' responsibility to motivating systematic change? So in thinking through and answering that question, I also want to, for each of you to answer that through the lens of the work that you do. And again, want to invite people to either offer some suggestions in the chat as well, and then also on the Padlets, wherever you feel most comfortable communicating. Coya?
I can jump in. One of the things that came, so in the last year, everyone who works at the theater school has been participating in a lot of anti-racism discussion, training, working with art equity, developing a plan for change. And one of the things that I noticed was coming up a lot is that people always think other people should change. Well, what we need is free tuition for everybody. That's how we'll get equity at the school. I'm like, okay, that will take $150 million endowment. One of the things I try to do as an administrator is let me just find out what that would take. Is that how you want to spend the next 10 years of your life working to like secure $150 million endowment? No, then free tuition isn't going to be where we're going to have systemic or structural change in the immediate. And one of the things that we did collectively was a power analysis, and not a power analysis based in social identity or role, but like role in the institution. Like, what could you tomorrow change? What text could you put into your syllabus? What show could you propose? How might you interact with students? How might you create networks and relationships like Eve is talking about? What's your sense of reciprocity in the city and around? You could do any of that. And then we started talking about microcultures, like what could the 5 of us get done if we were like hustling and collaborating together and pressuring, to start to form coalitions. Because sometimes in a university, and I think this is the case with any system or large institution, is that the structures are, they're not designed for quick pivots. They're not designed to be anti-racist. Again, I want to note that like Eve is pointing to a whole tradition of scholarship and academic unity that was exactly that. Like that's never going to work for us. We're going to go do this, and so like really understanding that like, what are the things we can do and can make that don't always require other people to help us do it, and then have really clear eyes on, no, we've done everything we can, and unless this university policy shifts, we're not going to be able to do more. And are people who love their scholarship and love their summers off and love going to work, direct a show, I'm going to take a sabbatical to direct a show, willing to put in the hard work of that structural change at the institutional level? That's not why I went to grad school, to be interim dean. I want to be a scholar studying ghosts and performance, And if not, who are the people who are really excited about academic administration, and how do we, mentor and sponsor? That's a word that I heard from the session on BTA presidents 2 days ago. Like people need mentors and sponsors. People are willing to be like, I got you. I'm going to help you do this, because that's really what we need. We make our own changes, and then we identify what change is imperative and who's going to do it.
I just want to also invite you to listen carefully in the spaces where things are happening. One of the really nice things at UC Davis right now is that a lot of our leadership is committed to this in different ways, and we finally got a coherent space. We finally brought an administrator in charge of all the DEI efforts, and that meant getting some grant funding from UCOP to do particular things. And I just, as an anecdote, when I participated in a community of practice talking about strategies for assistant professors of color, trying to deal with that, because that's often a space where people are over-serviced and other things. But out of that, we gave these presentations, and at the presentation, the provost of the whole UC was like, oh, that's a new one I hadn't heard. And I immediately fired off an email to the person who had edited that and said, we should send that in because that person just said that. And I didn't do anything except I'm listed as faculty advisor grant, but the grant came through because the person said, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that in all the talks I went to. Like, it sparked something for a person who has a high level of institutional power. So if you get a space where somebody has that and you hear any kind of sparking, just grab it.
For me, I just want to highlight like a 2-tier process that we're actively engaged in. Number one is students come in, and like I said, they make a particular choice to attend an HBCU or state college or anything like that. So we have to build their self-esteem. Right. And not only making this choice, but the work that we're doing, it has to be affirming. So I spend a good portion doing that. Then I send them out to dismantle these structures that we're talking about. So that's what I was talking about. I've got to get them a seat at the table so then they can dismantle that. That's really where we are. We're getting them to recognize, oh, yes, I'm not doing what a Georgia State, UGA, Kennesaw, any of these schools, Emory, that they're doing necessarily. But there's value in it. There is beauty in it. It doesn't have to all look one particular way. And I know that we're all saying that, but it's really important to share that with students of the global majority, to let them know that things that they heard at the picnic, you know, the family reunion, the picnic, all of these different things, these performative elements are normative, that they are beautiful, and that they need to be celebrated. Because when they come in, usually it's, oh, you know, I want to erase that. I want to embody this, you know, actor identity that looks like this and sounds like this. And there can be a place for that. But I want you to embody all of those different voices and experiences that you've learned growing up and that you've heard about your family ancestors. Let me normalize that. And then from there, I'm going to send you out. You know how to play the game, but you know what needs to be valued and what stories need to be told. And that's why we work closely with Kenny Leon, who is a graduate of CAU, and many others, Pearl Clegg, so many others in the Atlanta area. And that's what we're trying to do in the way that we're strategizing. And we need more. We need many other forms or ways to do that as well.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that too is I think the importance of cross-departmental and program collaboration on a campus, and also cross-institution collaboration. For me, I honestly think we would have greater power if those of us who share this desire and skill set to make the change unified across institutions. And this is what organizations like ATHE are supposed to be helping to facilitate. The question is, are we doing all that we can through this organization to do that? And so just encouraging people to think more strategically about how do we do that? Because Eve shouldn't have to work in isolation to provide this experience for her students, because once they move beyond that institution and go out into the world, there should be spaces where they can go, where they will continue to be valued and continue to be able to learn, develop, and contribute all that they can. So yeah, we have another question I want to add here. For those of us without tenure, especially adjunct or contingent faculty who have a very limited amount of influence over the department, we recognize the only place we do have some influence is over the students and the classes we teach. What do each of you think are the most important things we can do in our classrooms to do or to help our students of the global majority, and maybe also to educate our white students of the importance of this work? So I leave that question open to you. I just also want to reiterate the importance of structural change. I think there's a certain amount of advocacy that needs to be happening to support contingent faculty working in these spaces that do this work, but would love to hear more from you, in a direct answer to the question, what are the most important things we can do in the classrooms to help the students, the global majority, first and foremost, and also educate white students on the importance of the work?
I can jump in. I think two things, I think the first is like making sure that, depending on, I don't want to make assumptions about who's asking that question and who's listening, right? But I think that all of us can continue to educate ourselves, both kind of formally reading, but also just listening and paying attention to sort of the different ways that life shows up for our different students, and really bring in solidarity with them, like being willing to have their back, to believe what they're saying is true, to ask questions, that the students in some ways are the most vulnerable people we have in the thing, in terms of their feeling that they can't or can't, and so I think like just really like not dismissing what students are saying their experiences, I think is one of the most valuable things we can do as educators. I also think though that like things like the canon exist because we reify them. Like we're the ones saying like, this is the important stuff you have to learn and this is what the field is. And so really understanding where, in the context of anti-racism, where white supremacy and sort of white thinking has shown up in our own training and our own sense of what values and matters, and take that step back to be like, does it? And the example I give a lot is I teach our year-long history of dramatic literature class. And when I was a student, the first time I ever heard about Chinese opera, for example, or any kind of Eastern theatrical tradition was in the context of Brecht, and like Brecht is so important, director, and it's, and I was like, wait, it took me until like 3 years ago to be like, why the F am I starting to hear about like 1,000-year-old traditions when we get to Brecht, when like some German guy decided like, this is cool, let me translate it for now, instead of like, oh, cool, look how these things we studied last year are now showing up, in other practices, like we don't teach that way. And so one of the things that we've been doing in the history sequence is really going back and being like, how can we radically reimagine what matters today and how what happens today is influenced by the past? Like we teach theater history like the Greeks just like invented something, like Zeus pulled theater out of his head too, and not like what were the trade routes from Africa and Asia? What are these storytelling traditions? And like so many people are reluctant to teach in that way because they didn't learn it. And I'm like, well, you didn't learn it. And we can't keep passing this on to our students as the way things are. We can change it anytime.
Just a couple of small things. When somebody wrote in the chat to us, what better way is there than letting students, that was Karen DeMasters, what better way is there than letting students from the global majority write their own material and show their white friends their lives? And I do an exercise in my classes, several of them, not just where students write a short play and in the kind of more theoretical way, then they get to write a criticism of their own play, which is fascinating because then they get to see what it is it signifies in their community, why they're including these things. And I learn a great deal about what they think they're putting out and that I'm not necessarily always seeing because it's part of their understood community. So it's teaching me. I'm going to be cynical here in a couple of ways. One, if you're an adjunct, chances are nobody's paying that close attention to what you're doing. So you have some agency to engage the students. I mean, as horrific as this. Another one, the reverse of that, though, is if your colleagues are resistant, but you're not sure about your chair and you have a reportage from students, because some of the adjuncts get much more close relationships with students because in some programs, they're teaching the majority of the intro kind of classes. Take that information as just information passing to a chair and see how that's responded, because sometimes that information is already present and your information could help somebody with some power make some changes, especially if you're hearing about harm in a particular kind of way from students, because often your position also as a teaching assistant, if you're hearing about harm, then it's really important you have to balance that and make sure that you're not going into the generator of that harm and bringing that yourself. And there are other pathways, but just remembering it may not always be visible. Some of the spaces where there might be supported, there's concrete stuff.
Thank you, John. And one thing I just wanted to offer too, I think it is a valuable experience encouraging students to write about their own lives. I would never encourage global majority students to write about their own lives for their white peers or for anybody else. They should be writing for themselves and for their communities and whomever they choose to be writing to. And I only say that because I know there are some, some of the work we've done through the Craft Institute and collecting data about even how some of the playwriting programs are structured, that global majority students are being encouraged or told that they have to write, for a crossover audience, which is a predominantly white audience. And those are exactly the things that we need to unsettle and disrupt.
They should be writing in their own languages when they need to. I was in an interesting conversation that the Dramatist Guild was doing about Spanish language theater production in the US. And Elaine Romero was saying about an experience where a student wrote a play in Spanish and they read it in Spanish, even though not everybody read the Spanish because that was the language that story needed to be told in. And thinking about that, and African-American vernacular English is a language the story needs to be told in. And my language, my Creole, my mixing, my use of Englishes or other things is a story I need to tell.
But can I also, I agree with that, but I also think we have to think about the practicality of this sort of capitalistic structure that we're in, because, for example, and this was mentioned at one of the webinars, I believe it was yesterday, when talking about indigenous playwrights and getting that work produced and how that can be challenging. And it's the same for my students. Not only do I want to give them the space and the freedom to create things from their cultural experience, identities, backgrounds, all of these different things, but I also have to be very clear. This might not be produced. You have the burden. Many of them come in with the burden of their families, responsibility about, you know, I've got to get a job after this. This has to lead to a job. I have to be, you know, financially independent so that I can give back to the family, that I can help build the family. That's a heavy responsibility for students to carry. So I think there has to be sensitivity in the classroom to say, yes, you have the freedom to create, you know, to document these narratives that historically have passed through your family, but also we have to say or give pointers about how this work can live beyond, because, you know, we don't want to set them up for mainstream failure, if you will, you know, because like, and the only reason I'm saying that is because my students, most of them are not of independent means, and their parents didn't want them to major in the arts. They defied that, which took a lot of courage. And then, you know, I'm saying, okay, do this, but you're probably not going to earn money. So I have to be very, very sensitive and cognizant of, you know, that path or those challenges as well.
Thank you, Eve. So I just want to be conscious of time. We have about 12 minutes left on this panel. I also want to remind folks that there are 2 Padlet links that were posted in the chat that I encourage you, if you don't feel comfortable sharing your views on harm or solutions in the chat, you're welcome to post them anonymously on the Padlets. So additionally, we have, you know, a couple of questions that have come up. I'm just going to read these very quickly, and, you know, you all can comment, and I'm going to leave us about 5 minutes for some final words. So we'll run through this rather quickly. So someone has mentioned it's not unusual that contingent instructors don't have control over department curricula. This is true. Another has noted, this reflects my own lack, so I apologize. I've gotten my theater department to make a concerted effort in upcoming searches to diversify our faculty. They have gone through the regular academic channels in the past with not much success. We are New York-based, 45 minutes from New York City, which could be a draw. What are effective ways of getting word out that we are looking to enrich our department in that way? Understanding that we must create a safe and encouraging space for incoming colleagues. So this is something I just want to address really quickly, and you all can weigh in however you would like. But it's interesting because there's always that suggestion that we can't diversify the faculty because we don't know where to find people. And I, for one, know a lot of people who don't have jobs and could use them. Where the disconnect is happening, I think there needs to be a greater conversation on where are you looking, because people are here and they need the jobs. And so, you know, shameless plug, I'll say Nicole Hodges personally and I are going to be doing a presentation later today about a platform that we developed that is one place one might post jobs and find people that would want to do this, you know, this work. But there are also other spaces that exist. And so I think that is an active way that we can actually start to engage, not just on hiring people, but what happens to them once they get in the space, what sort of structural changes can be made to ensure that once they get there, they can actually do the work that they bring to the table, because often they're brought in and blocked from actually being able to do anything. And so I think that we should definitely put that on the table for strategic action, not just at the next conference, but throughout the year. And so more on that later. Anybody want to add to that before I read the final question here? Yes, Yutian.
I'll add, yeah, I think that's really important. And one thing we've been dealing with is, you know, we're often told, well, you know, you're not going to get any more, you know, tenure lines. So you should hire lecturers, you know, you should hire part-time faculty, right? And that, you know, and that's been a common practice in terms of if you want to include, you know, courses in different dance forms, right, to sort of diversify the curriculum. So that's one thing I've been struggling with, is that, you know, kind of administratively, right, we're encouraged to, you know, diversify the curriculum, you know, further diversify the faculty, but doing it, you know, through hiring more contingent labor, right, which reproduces, right, it further reproduces kind of that sort of equity in terms of sort of, you know, faculty, yeah, inequity.
And can I just really quickly add, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to be, you know, sort of antagonistic here, but I don't want to be the token anymore. I don't want to go to these institutions and there's only, you know, I'm the one person and I got to take on this whole burden. So I think, you know, to say with it, we have to think about who we're inviting in, how we're inviting them in, the space that they're going to be welcomed into, what the expectations are. And, you know, so I would just like to add that.
Yeah, I think it can, you know, like there's like two, you know, one of the things I'm thinking about a lot is that I'm the interim dean and we're doing a dean search, and I really want an external candidate. I'm not planning to apply for the job. And my dream would be a person of color to come in. But I ask myself all the time, like, is this school really ready? Or are we setting somebody up to fail? Because I know it is really, really hard for our faculty, our tenure track faculty of color, who are, you know, and almost all of our faculty of color are tenure track, not all of them, you know, to like, it's a wild place sometimes, you know, like that's just me being very diplomatic about it, you know, and so like, what does it mean to bring in leadership, like the boss, you know, to come into this place that's still really actively struggling with what it means to transform a conservatory, which is a pretty big wrangly thing compared to a lot of smaller programs. You know, like I'm really like I think of my job this year as trying to create as smooth a landing strip as possible for whoever comes in next. But it's something I'm incredibly anxious about, just watching like how demoralizing it is just to be a faculty, much less the boss of all the faculty, dealing with the provost and the president and budget constraints and all of those things. But happy to give anybody the inside scoop if you have your eye on that job, like an enthusiastic colleague and answering your questions honestly.
Thank you, Coya. So I'm going to, I'll just read the last question so we all know what it is. And then we'll kind of launch into what's next. So the question was, what are ways that our institutions are reaching out to two-year colleges? Our student populations are often global majority, and our institutions often have less resources, whether that be production budgets, staff, and or faculty. How can 4 years institutions collaborate and truly embrace our transfer students? Thank you for your thoughts. And so for this question, I would like to say, do reach out to us. This is something we're actually thinking about through the Craft Institute and some of the work we're doing through the Reparations, Healing, and Restorative Justice Initiative, recognizing that students from two-year colleges are, you know, definitely vulnerable within the space of academic training. And so with that, I just want to say how much I appreciate everybody speaking today about the ways in which you're approaching this work and the transformations that can and should be happening throughout academia in very specific ways. Coya, very much appreciate this Chicago-centric scope of it, because I do think there's great value in looking at the ways in which this happens in a particular region, or a particular city, which can serve as a really important case study for how we might think about how some of these issues are addressed in other areas of the country, which have to also address the very specific regional and cultural needs within that space. Yutian, I want to thank you also from the perspective that you're bringing, looking at this, how it's happening through dance in particular. And I think there's a lot of cross-pollination that can and does happen between theater and dance, and some of the harms and solutions that are happening in both spaces can be addressed together. So I'm really hoping that we can continue the conversation about how to make that happen. John, also want to note, very much appreciate you lifting up Puerto Rico in this conversation, and also the various Latinx specific elements to the conversation, specifically in talking about language, and the importance of us embracing and utilizing and allowing space for us to communicate in whatever way we need to in order to tell our stories truthfully in a way that resonates for our communities. And Eve, very much appreciate your insights as always, and looking forward to continuing to do the work through the Reparations Healing and Restorative Justice Initiative. Is particularly appreciative of you lifting up the particular challenges of historically Black colleges and universities. Hopefully in our next conversation, we can also draw in tribal colleges and also non-traditional academic spaces, which we had one of our comments in the chat. The academic institutional space is not the only space where learning is happening. And we need to acknowledge and embrace that and utilize that to the advantage of our communities. So with that said, is there any final word or thought that each of you would like to leave with the audience before we depart?
Do the work.
Let's find a way or make one to collaborate, to work together. Please, I'd love to partner. I've pointed out some problems, but this is about collaboration and building together.
I just want to say also, the work is never done, right? You constantly have to kind of go back and evaluate, that these choices we're making, right? Are they having the effect that we intended? Sometimes they don't, but being open to kind of going back and re-examining kind of what we're doing sort of constantly, right? Sort of being responsive. Yeah.
Thank you.
I guess I just loop back to Monica's point, that anti-racism is the beginning. It's not like, it's a low bar for the world we want to see.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to put in the chat here again for those of you who would be interested in I'm the outgoing VP of advocacy for ATHE. And so I can't commit the organization to anything that it does not want to do. I will say I'm in conversation with some of the folks that are continuing in leadership to see what might be possible. So I offer to you the work that I am doing with Eve and various others through the Craft Institute, the Reparations, Healing, and Restorative Justice Initiative. I put a link in the chat that gives you a bit of an overview of what that project is. For those who want to be actively engaged starting now, then do reach out. Let us know who you are and how you'd like to be engaged. And we will continue to do the work along with anybody else who's interested in doing it. So thank you all so much for joining us. I appreciate you making the time. And I look forward to seeing all of the great progress that we are going to make come hell or high water, because that's what needs to happen. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your weekend.
Thank you all so much for everything. This was wonderful. I appreciate you all. Have a great rest of your conference.
Well,
Bye, friends.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Reza. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.